Hello, I'm Rachel Hadas. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you at the conference at WashU devoted to James Merrill on the occasion of Langdon Hammer's extraordinary biography, but I'm sending this video, which consists of a slideshow of the Merrill house in Stonington, Connecticut, with some voiceover. I'm going to be reading a passage from the book of Ephraim, where Merrill describes the actual physical setting in his dining room, which you will see in the slideshow, where the seances took place. Then I'll be reading one poem of mine and one prose piece of mine, all with obvious relevance to Merrill. So this is the description from section B of the book of Ephraim of the physical setting, what Merrill calls the backdrop of the seances. The dining room at Stonington. Walls of ready-mixed matte flame, a witty shade, now watermelon, now sunburn. Overhead, a turn-of-the-century dome expressing white tin wreaths and fleur-de-lis in palpable relief to candlelight. Wallace Stevens, with that dislocated perspective of the newly dead, would take it for an alcove in the Baptist church next door, whose moonlit tower saw eye to eye with us. The room breathed sheer white curtains out. In blue elm and chimney-blotted shimmerings, so slight the tongue of land, so high the point of view. 1955 this would have been, second summer of our tenancy. Another year we'd buy the old eyesore, half of whose top story we now rented, build above that a glass room off a wooden star deck, put a fireplace in, make friends. Now, strangers to the village, did we even have a telephone? Who needed one? We had each other for communication and all the rest. The stage was set for Ephraim. Properties: a milk glass tabletop, a blue and white cup from the 5 and 10, pencil, paper, heavy cardboard sheet over which the letters A to Z spread in an arc, our covenant with whom it would concern. Also the Arabic numerals, and yes and no. What more could a familiar spirit want? Well, when he knew us better, he'd suggest we prop a mirror in the facing chair. Erect and gleaming, silver-hearted guest, we saw each other in it. He saw us. This is my poem. It's a sestina, a 39-line form where you'll hear recurring end words in each stanza. It was occasioned by the recent massive biography of Merrill by Langdon Hammer, and it's called Threshold and Mirror, the Biography. If merely to read the massive biography of a poet is arduous, then to write it beggars the imagination. To stand both close and far, to look forward and back, to measure experience through the mirror of pages, poems, letters. Poised at the threshold of such a life, a chronicle features several thresholds, including a biographer's, who sometimes peers into the cloudy mirror of his own past and writes in a crabbed cipher like Leonardo's. Backward slanting letters stand, facing the past. Or else the writer stands hesitant at this undertaking's threshold. Invited once, will he be welcomed back? Not every biographer completes the love letter he may have begun by wanting to write. The documents he assembles yield a mirror, but who will be reflected in that mirror? So many shards of mosaic. I once stood at the bottom of an Athenian staircase. Right above me waited my host, the poet. Threshold into a chapter of my youthful biography, I perceive only now I'm looking back. Books can be read either from front to back, or like a Hebrew book, Longfellow, mirror reversal of events. Biography, too, can be understood end to beginning. Advance over the threshold, and then retreat and start to read or write. This book's each sentence strives to get things right. The word flies forth and cannot be called back. From birth to death is not a single threshold, but countless arches, wilderness of mirrors, no right reflection, no matter where you stand. The brave biographer takes a stand, traces a range of thresholds, wavering in a lifetime's hall of mirrors. Death took the poet. This bio brings him back. I'm here in northern Vermont, near Calais, Vermont. I have long had a house between St. Johnsbury and Danville. Jimmy never visited that house, and I wish he had. I wish he could meet the man I'm married to now, who is photographing me as I speak, Shalom Gorewitz. Jimmy would have been happy in our happiness. And I think about him, and I miss him, and I'm nourished by the memory of our friendship and by his poetry every day, every day. In 1975, I was living in Athens on Mount Lycavatos. Jimmy was one of my neighbors, and so was Chester Kallman, W.H. Auden's partner. Kallman and Auden lived together in Austria half the year, but Auden did not like Greece and did not join Chester when Chester was in Athens during the winters. At this time, Kallman's life had become pretty disheveled and unraveled. He was drinking heavily and not in very good emotional shape. So it was not a total shock when he was found dead in his bed sometime early in 1975, but it still was disturbing enough. I remember sitting in Kallman's apartment with various friends who gathered there. Jimmy was there, and Jimmy reached over and took my hand, which was consoling. I remember the funeral in a Jewish quarter of the cemetery in Athens and the rabbi's wonderful black hats. I remember a number of us, Alan Anson, Bernie Weinbaum, Jimmy, David Jackson, myself, maybe a couple of other people, being taken in a limo to a patisserie in Kolonaki afterwards for brandy and pastry. And everyone was in a bad mood, as I recall, whether because Chester had died or because someone wanted to sit in the front seat of the limo and didn't get to. And after we had had our brandy and pastry, I remember very clearly Jimmy saying in a sort of a humorous, rueful voice, which simply had a lot of truth in it. It's hard to convey the tone, but I can remember it so clearly. He said, how like Chester that his funeral should leave everyone in a blind rage. We were not in a blind rage, we were simply rather peevish, and Jimmy was exaggerating, but there was a kind of a human perspicuity about what he said. Not without compassion, but sort of taking the measure of this grumpy group of people in the car, and in some way taking the measure of Chester as well. So that's one of my last memories of being Jimmy's neighbor in Athens. I'm standing across the road from my house in Danville, Vermont, waiting for my son Jonathan to come home in a couple of days. Jonathan is now 31. He was born in 1984 in New York, and Jimmy's and my friendship moved itself from Athens to New York after the late 70s, or the mid-70s. When Jonathan was a few months old, Jimmy gave him a present of a little book inscribed, "For Jonathan Edwards, who will need this volume when he starts to read." Sometime when Jonathan was quite young, there was some exchange or interchange when Jimmy gave him a beautiful piece of blue beach glass, which Jonathan in due course lost, and I wrote a poem called "The Blue Bead," which was how I remember that exchange. But what Jonathan remembers much better than that piece of beach glass is a little light bulb Jimmy gave him filled with small, suckable, hard candies. He ate the candy and kept the light bulb for quite a long time. It was no more than a few inches long. And Jonathan wrote a poem about this gift a few years ago, which I don't remember precisely, but he talks about the 100-watt symbol buried in time. That combination of sweetness, luminousness, what gets used up, the candy, and what remains, the light bulb, the symbol, the illumination, the communication, and the love, strikes me as very typical of Jimmy's ability to maintain friendships with people of all generations. I was 22 years younger than he was, and when we met in 1969, that seemed like a big age difference, but by the time he died in 1995, I felt that we were almost contemporaries. Jonathan continues to read and love Merrill's poetry now. And Merrill says in his memoir, A Different Person, about receiving a book of poems by his friend Hans Lodeysen, who had died of leukemia before his first book was published, wouldn't I too turn word by word, page by page, into a book on a shelf, understanding very well that what remains finally is the art. I miss Jimmy all the time, but luckily the art is still with us.